Okay. Good morning and welcome to the annual training for ethics. I'm Paul Corey, and I've been outside counsel for EAC for a number of years, and I'm delighted to be here to talk with you about ethics training. And you just heard from the CEO how important ethics is to what we do, and how important our commitment to doing the right thing is in terms of our relationships with government personnel, with vendors, and with all of the people that we deal with in doing the business that we do. Now, I often see things when they go wrong. And so just to give you just some context here, Department of Justice this past year ended up fining people over $4.7 billion for False Claims Act allegations, $4.7 billion to government contractors. There were over 702 whistleblower actions this past year. And that doesn't count criminal convictions and criminal actions against companies, as well as increasingly against individuals. The Department of Justice, and we'll be talking about a little bit later, has some new policies in place that tell companies, if you want to get any cooperation credit, if you're disclosing any potential wrongdoing, which you have an obligation to do, the only way you're going to get it is if you identify the specific individuals who are involved. And the government's going after individuals. So all of us want to protect against those kinds of things, and that's why we're here, as well as because of the commitment that you heard from the CEO that EAC wants to do the right thing. So how do I move to the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so before we get started, you heard reference to the Code of Ethics, and to the extent you don't have a copy, you will be getting the copy shortly. If you have one, great. I want to just talk to you about the resources. There are ethics officers that you can go to. One of them is sitting right here in the room, John Spear, also Brennan Kane. And EAC has an ethics hotline. If you have a concern, and I'm going to, sort of like if you're at the train station or whatever, and you hear that if you see something, say something. If you see something, say something, because that's going to protect the company and you more than just sort of keeping it to yourself. Okay, so just want to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to cover today. You've already gotten the message from the CEO. I'm going to talk a little bit about personal conduct issues. Some of these go beyond just sort of talking about government contracting issues and sort of conducting ourselves in the workplace. That's going to be just a short portion of what we do. And then I'm going to talk primarily about U.S. government contracting. And the point that I think I want to emphasize there is that doing business with the government is different. And things that in the commercial world would be perfectly acceptable can be a crime in federal government contracting. And there's been a kind of a shift towards criminalizing things that might really be just contract disputes in the commercial world. And so we're going to go over some of the areas where that is most the case. All of you know that it's a highly regulated industry, and that there are you got to know the rules to the extent that they're relevant to you. So I understand, for example, since last I started working with the company, that we're doing more cost reimbursement type work. Well, there are all sorts of rules that go along with that, and I understand there may even be some training on those kinds of things to the extent you guys get involved in that. So employees have to be familiar with the rules that govern what they do. Just to emphasize, the company believes it's extremely important to its success to continue to have an ethical environment. If you have any questions, you can consult with your supervisor, you can consult with the ethics officers, and the idea is you got to report any violations to at least one of those folks. So let's start with the personal conduct. So one of the topics here is personal conflicts of interest. Now, personal conflict of interest is when you have some financial or other interest that may be different from EACs or Aonians. What we're trying to accomplish here is any decision that you make, any action that you take on behalf of the company should be based on the merits of that action and not on any sort of personal interest. So what kinds of examples are we talking about? If you've got a financial interest in a competitor or a current or prospective supplier, or if one of your family members works at a competitor or a supplier, and you're in a position to decide who to pick, you may have a conflict of interest because you want to give business to your family member, for example. Now, where do we know, where have we seen this talked about a lot? Well, President of the United States, if he weren't the president, it would have personal conflicts of interest, given that he's got a hotel in DC that is being leased, that's got a lease with GSA. Well, he's on top of GSA and his family members own the hotel. In that circumstance, if you weren't president, there would be a conflict of interest. But let me talk about examples that I've seen where things go wrong. So, manager at a company decides to subcontract to another entity. Well, it happens to be his wife's company. That it could be that maybe his wife's company is the best company to provide the service that was being provided, but there's a potential conflict of interest there. And what one should do in that circumstance is recuse oneself from making that decision, disclose to whoever is going to make the decision that, this is my wife's company, and let somebody else make that kind of decision. Other kinds of potential personal conflicts of interest. If you're doing outside work for another entity that is taking time away, and you're doing that either while you're working here or it's taking time away from you being able to do your job here, that's a potential conflict of interest. What's another situation? I'm going to come back to this one. Commissions from vendors. If vendors are paying you extra to give them an ability to get business from us, or to give them referrals or anything along those lines, that could be a personal conflict of interest. We're not taking our actions based on personal gains. We're taking actions based on what makes most sense for the company. Misappropriation of business opportunities. If you hear about a possible opportunity that we can compete for, an RFQ that's on the street, that's not a situation where we should go and tell somebody else, hey, well, this might be worth pursuing. You can't misappropriate. In all of these examples, I've dealt with people and dealt with companies who've had people do these things, and it creates problems for the company, but ultimately for the individuals as well. Other personal conduct topics: confidentiality and non-disclosure. The kinds of information that you have access to as an employee, a lot of it is proprietary and confidential to EAC. So, for example, our rates, the rates that we charge, the opportunities that we're pursuing, the people that we are using to perform certain services. All of that kind of information is confidential and should not be shared widely. Similarly, we often will have vendors or teammates, subcontracts that we're involved with, and often the company will have to sign a non-disclosure agreement saying we're not going to disclose their information either. And so all of us have an obligation to protect that kind of information, to mark it as confidential and proprietary if it's a document, and to treat it confidentially. And to secure it electronically, so if so that you're not sort of allowing other people to use your to access to your passwords or whatever to get information. Other personal conduct stuff, and this is obvious to you, but everybody deserves to be free from any harassment or discrimination, and diversity is extremely important to EAT. And so I just want everybody to understand that this workplace has to be one where everybody is tolerant with each other. There are so many examples of people doing things that offend others, that create a work environment that is not one that EAC is going to tolerate. So I just have a couple of examples. So this Senator Bill Kintner, Nebraska State Senator, decided to retweet a joke about the Women's March that happened the day after the election. So he retweets something that he thinks is very funny. Well, it was offensive to a lot of women, and he ended up having to step down simply for retweeting something that he thought was amusing but that was very offensive. Let's not use this workplace for anything along those lines. A lot of people get emails, NSFW, not suitable for work. Well, yeah, it's not suitable for work, so don't be doing it. And so anyway, probably enough said on that. Again, just personal stuff, workplace safety. This is a place that should be free from any potential threats of any kind, and obviously no drug use or alcohol use. So I'll just give you an example. We had an example of an employee who was put on a PIP, performance improvement plan, and then the next day came in and sort of showed to his boss these pictures of these guns that he had just purchased. Well, that's threatening, and that kind of behavior is not something that the company can tolerate. Okay, so let's get to the meat of what we're talking about, which is U.S. government contracting. So just to give you an overview, I want to talk about some of the high-risk areas in government contracting. First, gifts and gratuities. This is dealing with government personnel. And this is especially of concern if you're in the same office with government personnel day in and day out. There are a lot of restrictions on how you can interact with those folks that are different from how you would interact on a commercial basis. And so we're going to be talking about any gifts, any gratuities that you provide could be problematic. Now, we're also going to talk about interaction with vendors and subcontractors, because although the rules are not quite as stringent, again, if vendors or subcontractors are providing you with various business courtesies or whatever, it can very easily escalate to something that could be a kickback. And so we're going to talk about that. It's extremely important, and I've seen it, in a number of situations. I think most recently you may have read about this company, Glen Marine, had the guy who was the head of it's called Fat Leonard. He it was in the papers a while ago. He was a contractor for the Navy, and he provided all sorts of gifts and other things to a number of admirals, etc. He's in prison now. But one of the things that some of our clients got caught up in is the Navy folks would come to them and say, "Oh no, you got to use these guys as your subcontractor. Yeah, use these guys as your subcontractor." And if you hear from the government, "This is who I want you to use," well, your first reaction is, "Well, that's who we should use." Well, we gotta be careful about that, and we can't just say, "Well, one government person who it turned out was corrupt told us to use these folks, so that's what we're going to do." We have to do our quality checks and references on any subcontractor or vendor we use. Labor charging and accurate timekeeping. This is a place where a lot of contractors get into trouble, and it's just got to be accurate. And we'll talk at a high level about some of the ways that things go awry there, and you're probably there's going to be more training on that, I think, later on today. Cost accounting and reasonable pricing. Again, to the extent that you guys are involved in cost plus kind of contracting, making sure that the costs that we charge are allowable and allocable, et cetera, is going to be important. And assuring that the government is getting a reasonable price and having the data to be able to do that. So a couple principles that you'll see sort of flow throughout everything we're talking about. One is that we're going to compete fairly and make all decisions just based on the merits, not based on anything else. And all of the statements made by EAC or by any of us are going to be accurate, complete, and up to date. And that's the best way to protect ourselves. Okay, so gifts to individuals, to government officials. So it's a crime to give anything of value to a public official in order to reward some past act or enhance the likelihood of any future act. And they're not supposed to be asking for any of those gifts. So our policy is not to offer business courtesies at all to government folks unless you've gotten approval in advance. So let's talk about some of the details there. Now, there are exceptions. If you're talking about certain items with little intrinsic value, a EAC pen or Aeonian pen or something like that, there's an exception for example, if you're having a breakfast meeting and you can have coffee and donuts, but even in that circumstance, usually you've got the ability for the government person to pay. There's an exception for gifts worth $20 or less per occasion, so you could theoretically pay for that $10 sandwich for a government person. By the way, though, they've just made those regs more clear. No alcohol. You couldn't even buy a beer, one beer, for a government person. Even if you are doing that and below the $20 threshold, it's only $50 for the full year. So the idea is this can't possibly be a recurring thing. So what's the theme of all this? Probably better not to get into that at all. It may be a little harder in situations where you are, and I know this group is not necessarily at government facilities, but if you're at the government facility and you're working side by side with government people, it becomes even harder. Oh, well, it's so-and-so's birthday today. What are we going to do? Let's all chip in to get a gift. That could be problematic. Oh, did you hear the terrible news about this contracting officer's son? There's a GoFundMe page. Oh, let's contribute to that. And again, prosecutors aren't looking at that kind of thing to pursue, but the bottom line is you might be making life more difficult for that person as well as for yourself if you get involved in that kind of in that kind of thing. Doesn't mean that you can't, you can't show empathy, you can't write a nice, heartfelt note, you can't do things, but you're not helping the government person if you're giving them gifts that could get you and them in trouble. Now, there are some other, just to additional exceptions I just want to make you aware of. So, one of them that's abused all the time is, oh no, these aren't gifts because this is a government person. We just have a good personal relationship. We're friends. Well, I've heard that, and then I've had the company person say, well, but I did expense it because there's a benefit to. If you're expensing a gift, it's not based on a personal relationship. And generally speaking, and if your personal relationship is, well, I work with them on a regular basis, that doesn't count either. There are some exceptions for former employer events. So somebody who used to work here and now works in the government, if you're inviting a bunch of people back, again, it's an area fraught with danger. There's another exception that we see used a lot and abused a fair amount called the widely attended gathering. Well, we're having our annual conference down in Miami, and we're inviting a bunch of people, so we're going to invite a bunch of government people to the after dinner drinks and cigar event or whatever it is. Well, that's not really what the widely attended gathering exception is meant to be about. Widely attended gathering exception is for situations where there may be a conference that is of value to the government folks to attend, and they've gotten written approval to attend it because it is deemed to be something of value. So, and beyond that, there's been some additional guidance provided to government people about whether to even accept something, even if it meets the criteria, if it's under $20 or whatever. So, would it raise questions about your integrity or your impartiality? What about the timing of it? If you get asked out to lunch the day after somebody has just submitted a proposal to you that you're evaluating, the timing of it could be questionable. So would that gift create the appearance of preferential treatment? So again, the best rule is this is an area you got to just be cautious in and try to avoid to the extent you can. Okay, so switching topics for a minute. Now we're going to talk about the Anti-Kickback Act. So now we're talking about dealing with non-government officials. Talking about dealing with either, if we're a subcontractor dealing with are we a subcontractor that much? So if we're a subcontractor dealing with a prime contractor, or if we're a prime contractor dealing with a subcontractor, we're dealing with vendors. So the rule is that you're prohibited from offering or providing anything of value for the purpose of obtaining favorable treatment in connection with a government contract or subcontract. So what does that mean? So things of value include money, trips, lodging, sporting events, etc. And if you are providing that in order to try to get a better, a better opportunity to subcontract, or if somebody's providing that to you, it could be a kickback. Now, everybody recognizes there's sort of common business courtesies out in the commercial world that people just will take others out to dinner as they're trying to figure out how they're going to do business. Sometimes they'll take them to a Nats game or what have you. But there need to be clear guidelines about how far you can go. So can you do those sorts of things? Yes, but within very strict limits. It's got to be consistent with customary business practices. It can't be cash. It can never be cash. And it can't be extravagant. So generally, if it's going to be over $100, it's out. And I'm going to give you some examples in a minute here. Can be a regular occurrence. So let me give you some examples of and I've seen every one of these from clients. So one of the situations we had, a vendor offered to take our client salespeople to the Masters golf tournament. Hell yeah, we've got a condo down there. You got to pay your way down, but once you're there, we've got a condo. We'll take you to the tournament in a couple days. Go out for dinner. That is way over the line. There is no way that that's not violative of our notion that you can't have lavish gifts there. The whole idea here is your decision to later hire that company should not be based on what they gave you. It should be based on the merits of what that company is up to. Some other examples that I've seen. Oh, hey, you can come. We're going to have a party where we go to a shooting range, and then afterwards we're going to go to a bourbon tasting. Really? That is not sort of a customary business scenario. Other examples. We had a client who had some vendors offer a day of beauty at a spa. Again, that's not sort of a common business courtesy or practice. Now here's another big example, spiffs. Are anybody familiar with what spiffs are at all? Some people nodding their head. So special performance incentive funds. It's got two F's though, because people think, oh, kind of spiffy. So spiffs. I was giving a training to another client, similar situation to this, and I said, oh, you can't accept you certainly can't accept cash, and you can't accept extravagant stuff. And they raised, well, that doesn't include spiffs, does it? I'm like, well, what are you talking about exactly? Well, let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So some, for example, hardware vendors will pay $500 to employees of contractors to set up meetings with government personnel so that they can sell their product to them and demonstrate their product for those personnel. I'll pay $500, all you gotta do is set up that meeting. That is a spiff. That is essentially the epitome of you're getting something of value personally for the purpose of getting this vendor some favorable treatment in connection with a contract, a government contract. What's another example? So a lot of these, again, hardware vendors or software vendors will offer to the salesperson who sells the most of their product in a particular month, you get a free trip to Aruba or something along those lines. That again is exactly what we're trying to avoid here. What's another example? So oftentimes, especially in service contracts where you've got to hire a lot of people to fill positions, the company will enter into some kind of arrangement with the recruiting company in order to fill those positions. If that recruiting company is coming around to individuals at EAC and saying, hey, for every referral that works out, I'll give you, a commission of X dollars. That's a spiff also, and it's potentially an Anti-Kickback Act violation. So those are areas that we have to be very careful about. So just to give you a sense of how DOJ views spiffs, and this is from a complaint in a situation where we're representing a company, this is what DOJ says about spiffs. It's a payment by the manufacturer to a salesperson or purchasing agent in exchange for arranging the sale or purchase of a product. It's an incentive and a reward utilized in private business to push a particular product. A spiff would be prohibited practice on federal contracts particularly when paid by subcontractors or vendors to purchasing agents working for prime contracts on a government contract. In such a setting, a spiff would be a per se or obvious kickback. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, but this is the view of the Department of Justice. And so all of us who are in a position where we hear about these things need to be aware that's what DOJ thinks about it, and they're the ones who are going after this stuff. Okay. Talk to you about how important it is to assure that our vendors and our subcontractors are companies of integrity and are companies that are good at what they do. And so obviously one of the first things we want to do is to assure that they haven't been excluded from doing government contracts. But then beyond that, we want to make sure that they have a good reputation for doing whatever it is we're wanting them to, we're hiring them to do. So with any new contractors, there's a requirement for 3 separate references, and only one of those references can be from the government, in a situation where a government says, oh, well, this is who I want you to use. Okay, that's one, but now we need 2 others. Because we have to not assume, but at least take into consideration the possibility that the person who is from the government, who's advising us to use a subcontractor, may have some ulterior motive for doing that, other than that's the best subcontractor to use. And I know that's cynical, but it's kind of the world that we live in. Okay, I just want to very quickly, you guys don't do any business outside of the U.S., do you? Or
usually any outside businesses with U.S. contract shops.
Okay, all right. Well, so the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act may or may not apply, but it's the same rules we discussed with respect to gratuities, but this time with respect to foreign entities. A lot of times we have contractors who are doing business in, for example, in the Middle East or what have you, and they have to work through agents to get stuff done over there. And one of the concerns, especially in places like Afghanistan, where you can't do anything without having cash on hand, and if you need visas or licenses or what have you, sometimes those agents will be paying off folks in the government, and that causes problems. Again, I don't think that's primarily something that that EAC faces, but just to be aware of it. And then we were talking about gratuities and gifts before. Bribes are a little different in that with the gratuities and gifts, there doesn't have to be an explicit sort of, if you do this, I'll do that, quid pro quo. With bribes, there are. I've seen situations, for example, where a construction contractor, after a contracting officer awards them a contract, builds an addition to their porch or something like that. And that could more appropriately fit into a bribe. But again, since we're not even giving out gratuities, we're not gonna get into a situation where we're worried about bribes. Okay, Procurement Integrity Act. So this is restrictions on obtaining either competitor information or source selection information in an ongoing procurement. And so, in particular, what the Procurement Integrity Act gets at is if you're going to be getting contractor bid or proposal information, other people's information, or source selection information. So what's contractor bid or proposal information? And it includes their prices, any portions of their response to a solicitation, or anything that's marked confidential, proprietary, etc. Now, one of the things that happens frequently as a result of people, multitasking and emailing things is contracting officers will often inadvertently send information meant for one company to another company. They'll send questions that were meant for offer A to offer B, and so it could be that there's no sort of nefarious reason that you're getting something, but you might be getting something you ought not have received, and we'll talk in a minute about what you should do in that scenario. Other things that you shouldn't be getting are source selection information. So other people's prices, source selection plans, independent government cost estimates, those kinds of things, that rankings of other competitors. Again, sometimes they're going to be inadvertently sent to you. But let me just talk to you about some red flags, and I've seen situations like this. So oftentimes, and we've done internal investigations where it turns out that the government personnel start using their home computer to send you stuff instead of their work computer. Oh, I'm sending you this from my home computer for obvious reasons. I've seen that. Or others will send you something saying, delete this email. It's sort of red flags that there may be a problem. We had a situation where the government person was providing an independent government cost estimate to an employee of one of our clients, and our client, that employee, ended up pleading guilty to being, now that same employee paid a commission to that government person, but both of those people ended up going to prison. So in situations where the government is trying to give you information that both sides know is improper, that's going to get you into trouble. But what happens if you do receive something that was inadvertently sent? Well, you should immediately report it to your management. You should not email it any further. Don't email it to somebody else and say, hey, what do I do with this? Figure out who's seen it. Advise whoever told you about it that you received it, you shouldn't have, and then tell them you're going to either destroy it or if it's actually physical, you want me to destroy it or return it to you, and keep a record of what you did, so that nobody can say that you somehow misused the information. Oftentimes, I'll get a call from a client who will say, hey, we were just told by the contracting officer that they sent our information to our competitor, and what should we do about that? Well, one of the things that we want the contracting officer to do is to assure that nobody, that whoever saw it was limited, and that they know who saw it. And generally what we will want to do is to say, hey, if they saw it, they shouldn't be allowed to continue to participate on the proposal team for our competitor. And so conversely, when we receive information, we don't want to taint anybody beyond who actually received it. So here's another one that's part of the Procurement Integrity Act, and this is hiring either current or former government people. So even approaching a government person who might be a counterpart on a contract we're working on and suggesting, hey, you might want to, hey, maybe you might want to come work here, can create problems, because what they're supposed to do in a situation where you're even broaching the subject is either reject the offer immediately or else go to their ethics folks and recuse themselves from doing any more, or from being responsible for your program anymore. And people have gone to prison for this. One of the big examples of this was Darlene Druyan, who had been the head of acquisition for the Air Force folks from Boeing were thinking about maybe hiring her. And so a senior exec from Boeing has a meeting with her and then emails some of his other folks, hey, I had a non-meeting meeting with Darlene. And then she ultimately ended up being offered a job there. Well, she was also responsible during that time for programs that Boeing was working on. And she ultimately, as a result, after she got hired by Boeing, ended up going to prison for having violated the revolving door rules. So there is a right way to do this, and we hire, a lot of our clients hire a number of former or current government people, but the right way to do it is to ask them about whether they have any restrictions on even discussing employment, and then once you get past that point, to have them fill out a very detailed form that lists what their role has been in the government, what they've had responsibility over, and then to get a letter from their designated agency ethics official where they also identify, here's what I would be doing if I came to work for EAC. Can I do it? And tell me what restrictions I have. And then only then, if we get a letter that sort of lays out, yeah, you can do that, will we go forward. Now, part of the problem with some of these letters, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out. If you don't tell the designated agency ethics official what programs you had worked on before, if you don't tell them, well, here's what I would be doing at EAC, you're going to get a letter that's kind of worthless, because it's just going to say, here's what the rules are, and here's what it'll say. If you were substantially involved in the program, well, you can't represent the company before the government in that program for a lifetime, and it'll have all these rules, but it won't be particularly helpful because you don't have specifics. Okay. Switching topics. So accurate record keeping and recording of all business information. Very important that, especially now that we're doing timekeeping, etc., that all of our entries are accurate. So I will say that time charging continues to be one of the areas that most people get in trouble on. So one of the things that we've seen a fair amount is charging to the wrong contract. If you've got a cost reimbursement contract on the one hand and a fixed price contract on the other, and you're really doing work under the fixed price contract, but you're charging to the cost reimbursement one, you are creating what ultimately it could be a false claim. We've seen a lot of that. I had another internal investigation where people were filling out their time cards, and there was a button that made it easier to just say, yeah, my time's the same as it was last week. And that was a really bad button to have on there, because people abuse that, and well, wait a minute, it was a 3-day it was a 3-day weekend this week, and you're charging for your Monday. One of the other areas that we've seen a fair amount of is charging for personnel without the correct labor categories, or qualifications. So, for example, we'll talk about it a little bit later. I mean, if you're supposed to be providing people who've had 5 years or 10 years of management experience, and you're charging for somebody who doesn't have that experience or the equal alternative, again, that could be mischarging. And we see regularly companies, when they discover this, have an obligation to mandatorily disclose that information, not just to contracting officers, but also to inspectors general. And that is the area of probably most reporting that we see. In addition, and I'm not going to go into the specifics of this, but we also obviously need to assure that we're complying with the FAR cost principles when we're involved with cost reimbursement contracts. So that means not including unallowable costs in our rates. So, for example, costs for entertainment or costs for advertising. Truth in Negotiations Act. So, and you probably don't regularly have to actually certify under the Truth in Negotiations Act. It's basically an act that says we, the government, want to assure that we're getting a reasonable price. And how we're going to do that is we're going to ask you to, in certain instances where we don't have adequate competition, we're going to ask you to certify that you are providing us with all of the information that we would possibly want to know to be able to assure that you're not getting too much profit. So, for example, we want to know what your overhead is. We want to know how much your vendors charge. We want to know, what quotes you got from certain folks, and you have an obligation in those certain circumstances to certify that all the data you gave to the government was accurate, current, and complete. And the government can come back afterwards and say, wait a minute, you didn't disclose this or that, and get a actual reduction in the price. Now, for you all, I think for the most part, you're going to be in a situation where certification isn't required because you've got adequate competition in a lot of circumstances. But even if it isn't required, the government is going to be asking for what's called other, or can ask for other than certified cost of pricing data, which is supposed to be as unobtrusive as possible. So in the first instance, if the government has information about prices that are the same for same or similar items, that's first what they could go to. Then market or contract prices, relying first on their own information. But if none of that works, then they can come to you and ask for that data. And again, we want to make sure it's accurate and complete, even if it's not certified. So this also means and we've seen situations where in the scenarios where subcontractors may be corrupt, as in the example I gave you before, where subcontractors may be trying to inflate their prices to us. And in those circumstances, we have to do our own independent pricing estimates on the vendor quotes and make sure that we're getting a fair deal. And so, especially in the larger deals, there's an obligation to do that. Okay. So, the criminal statutes and civil statutes. False Statements Act, and I've been saying it's important to be accurate in what we do, and part of the reason is the False Statements Act. If we knowingly make a false statement to the government or actually to a subcontractor, that can be a crime. And what counts? Any certification in a proposal, invoices, letters to the government, receipts, quotes, any of that, if we know what we're putting in there is not accurate, it could potentially be a false statement. It must be important, but the government doesn't even have to rely on it in order for this to be a false statement. So, an example, famous Supreme Court case, it was a principle called the exculpatory no principle. So, government investigators know that a particular individual had used money in a fund for personal purposes. They have the evidence of it. They go to his house, 6 a.m, say, hey, we want to talk to you. Hey, did you improperly use these funds? No, that's all he says. They say, all right, well, thank you very much. You've now lied to us. We're going to charge you not with improperly using the funds with just lying to us, because it's easy to prove. We already have the evidence. And you know, what they say a lot in DC, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. I mean, often it's the crime too, but what did Martha Stewart go to jail for? People say, oh, well, insider trading. No, for lying to the government investigators. They asked her, did you call your broker and tell them X? And they knew very well that's what she had done. She said, no, it's easy to prove. Prosecutors don't have to prove anything else. Scooter Libby from way back in the day, who gave up Valerie Plain's name to a reporter, he didn't go to jail for that. He went to jail for lying about it when he was asked about it. So General Michael Flynn, he hasn't been charged of anything now, but around town everybody was like, well, you know, did he say that to the FBI? Did he deny to the FBI that he had potentially talked about sanctions with folks from Russia? Well, yeah, he denied it. And so the question on everybody's mind and why they were concerned about that is, well, they might go after him for false statement. Now, in our world, so False Statements Act cases come up in different contexts. So if we're making a certification about, you know, compliance with small business standards, or if we're making representations about availability of key personnel when we know they're not available or something like that, that could turn into a false statement. I had a case involving availability of key personnel, which is an issue that comes up. You know, you bid on a contract, you identify your key personnel, and then the government takes 6 months to figure out whether they're going to award the contract or not. In the meantime, your personnel's gone somewhere else. What do you do in that circumstance if they come back to you and say, hey, well, we want you to extend your bid and you know, indicate that nothing has changed in your bid? And what do you do in that circumstance if the person is left? It's kind of a problem that comes up frequently, and it's a difficult area. But we had a situation where a competitor of our clients, and our client was an incumbent, put in its proposal, we have signed letters of commitment for all of the incumbent personnel. And our client knew that their employees hadn't signed letters of commitment. And later on, we filed a protest that they weren't going to be able to provide these people. And later on, the person who made that certification said, well, when I said we had signed letters of commitment, what I meant is we had signed them, but we hadn't sent them to the employees to have them sign them. So, you know, the GAO ended up finding that was a misrepresentation, and that could become a False Statement Act violation. So, you know, again, to reiterate, it's our policy that all the statements that made to the government or to hire tier contractors are going to be accurate and complete. In fact, all statements we make are going to be accurate and complete. All right, so related to it is the False Claims Act. So it's crime to basically submit an invoice if we know that we haven't actually provided what the invoice is for. And again, it could be presented to a subcontractor. So if we are knowingly charging for services that we didn't provide, or if we're knowingly including unallowable costs in an invoice, those can be problematic. The problem with the False Claims Act is there's a bunch of law now that's come out about not expressly certifying something, but implied certification. So there's a case law out there that has suggested that every time you submit an invoice, you are impliedly certifying that not only whatever you say is provided was provided, but that you have met all of the other obligations under your contract. So in the SAIC case up here, A company submitted an invoice, and every single invoice they submitted was determined to be an implied certification that their subcontractor didn't have an organizational conflict of interest that would give the prime contractor an advantage. And the contractor said, I didn't certify to any of that, but the DC Circuit held, well, but you were impliedly certifying that by simply submitting an invoice. The triple canopy case, kind of an interesting one. So this was a contract for guards at Al Asad Air Base in Iraq, and the contract had a requirement that the guards have a certain marksmanship score on a test that was required to be done. Well, those guards did not meet the marksmanship standard. They couldn't zero their guns, and what have you. Nonetheless, they did provide the service. The guards showed up and did everything. And Triple Canopy never provided to the government the scores or certification that, hey, these guards met these criteria. But nonetheless, what the Fourth Circuit ended up holding is when you submitted an invoice for those guards, you were impliedly certifying that they actually could shoot straight. And therefore, each and every one of your invoices is a false claim. Most recently, the Supreme Court just decided this case, Escobar. So the family of a patient who died at a mental health center sues and says, you were submitting invoices to Medicaid for services provided when you knew good and well that you didn't meet some of the staffing composition requirements that Medicaid calls for. And the Supreme Court held that the applied certification theory is one that can be pursued by prosecutors. And so, if you submit an invoice that suggests that you have done what you're supposed to have done, you could get in trouble under the applied certification theory. So just very broad-based situation where we got to assure that we are complying with all material aspects of our contract obligations. Mandatory disclosure obligation. So the FAR requires all companies, if they learn of any credible evidence of any violation of the kinds of things we've been talking about, that they disclose that information to the contracting officer as well as to the relevant inspector general. So what that means is the company has to become aware as quickly as possible of the kinds of things that could lead to requiring a disclosure. That's why each and every one of you is important to assuring our compliance. If we've got an obligation to disclose, now generally it's something where principals have to be regularly asked about whether they're aware of anything along these lines. But if we've got an obligation to disclose, the employees of the company are the folks who are going to allow us to learn about these kinds of things. Now, just to, and I mentioned this at the beginning. One of the concerns that should be of paramount importance to all individuals here is that the Department of Justice has issued guidance to its prosecutors that say, in a circumstance where there is a disclosure, we're not going to give the company credit for cooperation unless they come to us and tell us the very specific individuals who did whatever it is that's alleged. unless they provide us the underlying emails, unless they provide us the data about the individuals involved, and you prosecutors should go after those individuals. So this is kind of a wake-up call that, you know, Department of Justice is going to look to anybody who's potentially engaged in wrongdoing, any individual who's potentially engaged in wrongdoing in government contracting. So if we're audited, if we're investigated, EAC's committed to full cooperation with the government. You know, there's one of the things that we see often is, oh, now there's investigation and people go off and start deleting emails. That's obstruction of justice, and that's not going to be tolerated. And it's amazing to me how many people, when they go do that, don't seem to understand that they're leaving a huge trail of exactly what they're doing. And again, the cover-up is usually worse than the crime, or at least as bad as the crime and easier to find. Now, one of the tricks of, or not tricks, but one of the modus operandi of investigators and special agents is to show up at employees' houses at 6 in the morning or what have you and start knocking on the door and asking questions. Now, what are your rights in that circumstance? You have the right to say, yeah, look, I want to cooperate, but I want to coordinate with my employer. I want to maybe talk to my own counsel. You have the absolute right to do that. You have the right to talk to them. You have the right to set up how you're going to talk to them. EAC's going to want to assure that we are cooperating as a company, but it's going to be a lot better if you notify the company so that you know, we can try to help if we can. Okay, I'm going to talk very quickly about organizational conflicts of interest. Excuse me for a second. So, organizational conflicts of interest arise in situations where if you do some kind of work, it may preclude you from being able to do other kinds of work for the government. And there are really three types. The first is called impaired objectivity. So this is a scenario where if, for example, you are providing the government, if you're working for the government as a CETA contractor, systems engineering and technical assistance contractor, and you're giving them advice on what they should purchase down the line, well, then you can't bid on the work for what they should purchase down the line because you might have an incentive to favor yourself. Likewise, if you are giving the government advice on how to evaluate the work of other contractors they have, well, you shouldn't be evaluating the work of an affiliated company because you might have an incentive to benefit that company. You might have impaired objectivity. Another scenario is biased ground rules. If you're being asked to draft a statement of work or draft the specs for something the government wants to purchase, well, then you probably shouldn't be, again, competing to respond to that statement of work or respond to those biased ground rules, or respond to those specifications because you might have biased the ground rules in your favor, so that only that EAC has a better shot than anybody else. This actually arises often in a scenario where the contracting officer who's lazy will come to the incumbent and say, hey, you know, we're going to have a follow-on. Can you draft up, you know, what you do and draft up, you know, essentially what I can use for the follow-on solicitation. That creates concerns that you might be in a scenario where you're providing biased ground rules, and so that's a situation where you're going to want to talk to counsel because there are ways we can allow you to help the contracting officer without entering into a biased ground rule scenario. Unequal access to information. You may have a contract where you're helping the agency out, and you're getting access to their budgetary data, you're getting access to information about what other contractors' rates are, or what have you. And in that circumstance, that information might be helpful in a follow-on competition. That again creates a potential organizational conflict of interest. Now, the whole idea behind all of these is a lot of them can be mitigated. So for example, with the unequal access, well, you can wall those people off from bidding on any future scenario. Generally, how these are enforced is through bid protests. Your competitors will probably be aware of some of this and will file a bid protest saying, hey, EAC has an OCI, they shouldn't have won this contract. So some examples, as I said, the CETA situation. Another one, hiring of a former government person. So there's a case a while ago, Aetna was bidding on a huge Medicare contract, and it won a multi-billion-dollar contract, but it had hired a former government employee from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and that person had access to proprietary information. Well, ultimately, Aetna was disqualified from that work because of an organizational conflict of interest. They had unequal access to information. As I mentioned, request for help in preparing an RFP can get you into trouble. And then in situations where you may be talking about acquiring a company that might, that might be separately doing CETA work for the government, even if you're just in discussions with that company, that could create a scenario where that company's work could give your company an OCI. So a lot of what I've talked about today is sort of for issue spotting for you. If you see a scenario that looks something like this, well, maybe you ought to say, see something, say something. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but the point is, you can individually be active politically, but federal and state laws prohibit what EAC can contribute. So for example, if you're using your work email to invite people to a fundraiser for a particular congressman, that could be attributed to EAC as a contribution in and of itself and could create problems. So find to be active politically on your own time and at your own expense. Antitrust and bid rigging. So it's very important that when we're submitting bids that we're not colluding or talking to any other potential competitors about what we're up to. I've run into circumstances in a lot of scenarios talk about complementary bids or third bids. So when the government buys stuff like off the GSA schedule, the rules say the contracting officer should get 3 quotes. And they can get less, but then they have work to do. They have to write up a justification for it. So contracting officers are lazy. They want 3 quotes. That's what they want. Now, in a lot of, especially in the IT world, all the distributors and value-added resellers know, hey, if a particular VAR has registered the deal, they're going to get a better discount than anybody else. And so, they're probably going to win. But nonetheless, the contracting officer wants 3 quotes. So one of the habits that we saw a lot of companies getting into was they would call some other value-added reseller and say, hey, will you lob a third bid over for this particular RFQ? I'll do it for you on the next one. Well, that's complementary bidding. It's sort of, hey, throw in a bid that is not going to win here, and I'll do the same for you later. And there are a number of investigations about it, and a number of companies have gotten into trouble over it. When we submit bids and fixed price contracting. We're filling out a certificate of independent price determination that our price has been arrived at independently without communicating with anybody else. You know, that we didn't try to have somebody either bid or not bid. And so we've got to make sure that that's accurate. Okay, as I mentioned, we all have an obligation to report something if we think there may be potential wrongdoing. You know, it's a violation to retaliate against anybody who reports anything. There are federal whistleblower protections. You're doing the company a favor if you report something that may be wrong, even if you're not sure that it is. And so you've got hotline numbers. If you wanted to call the defense hotline number, that's there. I will say it's better for the company's perspective if you call the EAC hotline, because then the company can actually address the problem, which is more beneficial. You know, I don't have to emphasize this, but every performance review will be looking at ethical behavior, and failure to comply can lead to repercussions for the company as well as for the individual. So, you know, we want cooperation with this. And you've got one of the people you could go to for more information sitting right here in the room, but you can go to your managers, you know, we're all available to try to provide guidance in this area. I know thrown a lot of material at you, and I'm sorry about that. The idea isn't for you to actually be able to, you know, speak, you know, in detail about each of these things, but I wanted to sort of put those ideas in your mind so that if something comes up that's a concern, we can address it. Happy to answer any questions if anybody